He's very famous, so I don't need really to tell what he is. And it's a collaboration with Luca about many points. The only thing that I would like to point out is really that it was really interdisciplinary, because it was passed from population genetics to cancer genetics in a way that it was very important and meaningful. But I stop here, so please go ahead with your talk. Thank you.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk to you in English, I'm afraid.
Sure.
And I hope you'll understand me. It's a great pleasure to be here at this symposium in honor of my great friend and collaborator and colleague, Luca Cavalli-Sforza, whom I first met. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I first met in Cambridge when I was a student some 63 years ago. And the title of my talk, The Genetics of Human Populations, is the title of the book that Luca and I wrote, which I think in its way became quite a classic, and which we worked on for over a period of, really, it started 9 years before it was published, and most of the work was done in 6 years, and then when Luca came to Stanford, just before I left. And what do I do about the slides? Does this work, the slides?
Yes, I think so.
No, it doesn't. Better turn this down. Does this work?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, yes, it does. Okay. So that's a picture of me and Luca in Pavia, which some of you may recognise, in front of the river. And that was in 1963 when we first started a serious work on the book that we wrote together. And really what I'm going to talk to you about, thank you. Eventually it'll get sorted out. I'm going to talk to you a bit about the history and Luca's involvement. And then I'm going to tell you about some work that I've been involved in the UK, which is very much the sort of study in details of populations one can do now at the DNA level using that information in a way that I know that Luca wanted to do, and maybe Alberto, who may be talking about what similar work that was done in Italy. But I want to start with some background. Not all of you may be familiar with the details of genetics. And the next slide really is where it all started. Most of you, I imagine, may have given blood as a blood donor and know that you have to be matched for your ABO blood types, simply inherited. They were the first simply inherited Mendelian differences in human populations that were polymorphic, that varied. And they're represented there by whether your blood is coagulated, forms clusters of cells when there's a positive reaction, and you can distinguish the four main basic types, AB and O. And in fact, it was the Hirschfelds who in 1919 published the first paper that really tried to study what happens when you look at genetic variation in human populations. They were also the ones that first pointed out that the ABO blood groups were inherited just in the way that Mendel had described in his famous experiments on the peas. So the Hirschfelds did a study. You can see each column is defined by different populations, not quite the way we do it now. The English and the French is all right. Not quite sure how you distinguish the Jews from the Arabs and the Germans. But one of the striking things that you see there was looking at the frequency of A, which is the hashed line, and of B, which is the solid one. And you can see that there's a persistent change in the frequency of B, which goes up from a low level in Europe and Western Europe, including the UK, to being much higher in frequency in Asia. And that was really the first case of saying, well, can you say something about population differences by looking at the frequencies of clear-cut genetic variation. The Hirschfelds actually went rather further than we might do to now. They said the world was divided into the A's and the B's. Whether they thought the A's were better than the B's or not isn't entirely clear, and that's, of course, what underlies a lot of the issues when people talk about racial differences. I tend to use the word ethnic. There are genetic differences between populations, but they are not matters of quality of difference, they are matters of the factual difference in frequencies of different variants. Now, in the book, the next slide, if you follow what happened subsequently, this is actually taken from the second book that Luca and I wrote on genetics, evolution, and man. And it's based on a technology that he developed of mapping the frequencies of different genetic variations. And the one on the left and the right is the total frequency of B. And you can see that the frequency of the B type follows exactly what the Hirschfelds found. It's much more frequent in India and parts of Asia around there. It's very low in frequency in Europe, and it's essentially absent in the Americas. And it was Luca, together with his colleague and my friend Anthony Edwards, who first showed how you could take this sort of genetic variation and construct a phylogeny, a thing that looks like a pedigree of the relationships between populations based on the frequencies of these sorts of variations. And they were doing it on what was available at that time, which was the blood groups. There was no DNA that can give you millions of variations. They were limited. And this was one of the later trees that they got in a book that I think Alberto might be quite familiar with, or he was probably involved in helping to produce that. And if you look at this, you'll see, I hope you can see at the top, the cluster. This is just like a phylogeny. The closer things are together, the more related they are, and you measure the difference between populations by the extent to which they differ for the frequency of genetic variants. And you can see when you take that into account, you can construct this phylogeny based on similarities, and it comes together remarkably well. So you're doing it on a genetic basis. The African populations come together, the Europeans come together, Pacific Islanders, and you get a remarkable concordance at a world level, if you will, between what you find out between the genetic variation that you're looking at and what you're putting it onto a map, in a sense, of the world in terms of the frequencies that you find. And Alberto mentioned my involvement in the Hla system, which is still the most variable genetic system. It's the system of genetic differences that you use for matching people for transplantation. And that alone provided about 25% of the data for this particular calculation, which was the work that was done with Anthony Edwards, pioneering work in how you can get a handle on the relationships between human populations by looking at these patterns of genetic variation. And another important application of that Luca did, which is on the next slide, was you can use what's called principal components. You hear a lot about artificial intelligence and machine learning, and in fact principal components are statistical analysis, the way of pulling out the major source of variation in data is machine learning, and it's a very powerful way of getting analysis. And what Luca did is he took the frequencies with his colleagues of genetic variation throughout Europe, and he took the first principal component that says that the amount that most explains the variation, and you can plot that as a quantity, and it varies across Europe in a sort of expanding series of contours, suggesting that there was a pattern of genetic variation that moved across Europe as if it was coming from the origins of agriculture in the Fertile Crescent and moving northward. And this was the basis for his idea, which he discussed extensively with Ammerman,
that actually it represented the movement of people taking agriculture from where it started, step by step, slowly, intermingling with the population to which they went to. So it gradually diluted out the difference of the genetic differences between the origins of agriculture and where it was spreading to. And I think it's an idea that still holds true and is an explanation, again, of how you can use genetic variation to say something that's important about the origins of human populations and how they relate to features of migration and selection, of course, as well. Luca himself was not only practical in analysis of data, but also in being very keen on collecting his own information, something that I learned from the mentor that we both shared, R.A. Fisher, the famous geneticist and statistician. And so he was very fond of collecting data, and we had the good fortune on one occasion to go with him in early 1968 to study the pygmies in the Central African Republic, where he did a lot of work over a number of years, some of the earliest clear-cut genetic studies of those populations. And you can see there, these are pictures that I took. Luca at the top, I think that's me there. You can see there my late wife is standing next to Luca, and you can see some of the pygmies with the Basenji dogs, which are characteristic of that area. Well, with that background and with the interest that Luca had in what you can do about understanding populations by looking at genetic variation, I want to tell you about a study that I've been involved in that takes this from the macro level that Luca did, looking at relationships between populations overall on a world level, to the micro level, to say if you look in a country like the UK and you do a detailed genetic study, what can you find out about the relationships between the people in the UK, people whom you wouldn't think shared enough to be different from one part of the UK to another? And in fact, we've shown that that's clearly not true, and you can see quite fine, remarkably fine variations using these same techniques in a way that came from what Luca did, but using them at the much more refined level one can do now, because you can look, instead of just a few markers, you can look at millions of them together. So I want to tell you then what was the nature of this study, and to some extent why we did it. The idea was to characterize the pattern of genetic variation, the genetic structure, as we say, in the British population. It was supported by the Wellcome Trust, who supports human medical research, and the rationale for them supporting us was that when you do studies looking for genetic components of disease, you look at the frequency of genetic variance in a disease group versus a control group, and if it's higher in the disease group, that tells you something about inheritance of a susceptibility connected with the different frequencies. And in order to do that, you have to have a good control group. So we made the case to the Wellcome Trust that we had to have a good control group. And our aim was to study the British population as it was before extensive migration that you had, especially toward the end of the 19th century because of the Industrial Revolution. So we went only into rural areas, not the big cities where everything gets mixed up. And we tried to get people only who were such that all four of their grandparents came from roughly the same area. So we narrowed it down to try and get the true Brits, if you will, the people who really came from where we were studying them. And it was, I say, funded by the Wellcome Trust. And what we did is we did a genetic study, which you can do nowadays, on a large number of markers. In fact, it was on 500,000 markers. The reason that the number matters is you can obviously get much more information if you use a larger number of differences than a smaller one. We also, together with colleagues, Peter Donnelly and others in Oxford, used an approach to looking at similarity that takes into account not only the number of differences between people, but where they are along the chromosomes. I won't go into the detail on that, but by doing that, and not just looking at the frequencies, you get much more detailed information. That's what that linkage disequilibrium refers to. So you can get a much finer sense of just how much difference is there between people who come from one area or another. So the aim was to do this study, and eventually we got about 4,000 people and only analyzed in the end what I'm going to talk to you about half of those, that satisfied these criteria and that were looked at using this technology with 500,000, I should say, markers. And what you can do when you do that is you can say, can we group people so that within a cluster of people, they're more similar to each other genetically than they are to anyone else who's outside that cluster. And if you go through that, you can eventually cluster all the people until you get to a level where the clusters are too small to be meaningful. And that's what we did. And then you can take that information of those clusters, which is entirely obtained just through the genetics. And we know where the people come from. We know where their grandparents came from. So we can put them on a map. And if we use a symbol, each individual with a symbol, different symbols for different clusters, we can see to what extent do the clusters of similar people map to the same areas of the country. And the result to us was quite extraordinarily striking. And that's what you can see there. I'm going to discuss it in more detail. But you can see the large red group, which are the ones with the squares, and you can see circles of blue and so on, and different colors. And each of those patterns of colors reflect people who are shown to be significantly more similar within that cluster than they are to any of the other groups. But that was done without knowledge of where they came from. But when you look at that map, it's quite striking. I'm sure you'll agree to what extent that genetic analysis could place people on the map of the UK at a level of discrimination that was quite unimaginable even at the time when we started that study. It's a micro version of what Luca and Anthony Edwards did when they obtained their genetic trees looking at the relationships between much more diverse populations and how they fitted on the map of the world. So I want to take you through this a little bit because I think it shows in a very interesting way what you can do at this sort of level, and which can be done in almost any population, although the conditions under which you do it may be somewhat different. And I want you just to look at that picture, and then what I'm going to show you now is you can analyze this in the following way. You can say, let's take the one group that is most different from every other, and then remove that and look at the next group that is most different from what's remaining. And you can build a hierarchy of things in that way. And I want to take you down through that and perhaps give you a little geographical explanation of what the UK actually is and looks like. So if we take the first example, if you look at that, everything's red in the country, but there's one little bit of yellow at the top, and that's the Orkney Islands. And that showed up as the most distinctive, genetically distinctive group within the UK population. Now, if you know anything, and I'm sure most of you will know the history. The Orkney Islands were actually a Norse Viking kingdom for some 500 years. And so what you're seeing there, and I'm going ahead of myself and I'll explain this later, is actually the influence of the Norse Viking invasion and the admixture with the people that were there. So the next difference, I don't know whether you want to guess, those of you know, but just to remind you that that's Wales here, that's Cornwall and Devon, the west of England, there's Scotland above there, and that's Northern Ireland. Now we only did Northern Ireland because the Wellcome Trust doesn't support, notionally, research in the Republic of Ireland, but Northern Ireland is reasonably representative of the rest of Ireland. So you can say, well, what happens next if we look at the next different group? The striking thing there was, and I have to say we didn't really expect it, the biggest difference there is Wales versus the rest. And I'll come back to that later because it actually tells you something about the importance of that difference in relation to the history of the British populations. And then you can go down the next level. And if you look carefully, you'll see what happens. You'll see that you split England from Scotland. You'll see that, interestingly, at this level, you're splitting North and South Wales, which says that they're almost as different as Wales is from the rest of the country. And North and South Wales, Gwynedd and Dyfed, they were small kingdoms that formed after the Romans left. And so you're seeing a remnant of the effect of those small kingdoms some 2,000 years ago, still reflected in the genetics of those differences. And there you can see Cornwall coming up, quite clearly Cornwall, not Devon, which is there, Cornwall. But you can't say that all these are similar. I mean, there's a notion of the Celtic fringe being up on this side of the country, which sort of ignores the fact that Celtic is actually not a genetic thing. It's a cultural difference. And that's quite important in the interpretation of this sort of data. So then you can go to the next difference. And if you look carefully, you can see, let's see, have I pressed that button properly? I should have mentioned at that stage that there's also a split in Orkney. So Orkney shows variation within Orkney that is similar to variation within the UK. Now you can see something else coming up here. This is Devon, and that's Cornwall. And there's a very sharp dividing line between Devon and Cornwall. They do consider themselves as quite different. But no one would have guessed that at this level of genetics, you could actually distinguish Cornish people from Devon. Remember that these differences are very small, but they're statistically significant. They're enough to say that in some cases, which happened to us, you can tell where a person comes from based on his genetic or her genetic makeup. And there you can begin to see the Welsh borders coming up, and you can begin to see differences between the north of England and Scotland. And I have to press it. No. Yeah, that's, if you just look carefully as I press this button and see what color comes up next. And one that's very interesting there is this small difference here. I should emphasize the sharp difference between Devon and Cornwall is really quite striking. I mean, it's quite where that division of the counties is nowadays. And here you're seeing a small group of different people in Wales, which actually probably correspond historically to something that's called Little England beyond Wales, where Henry II in the 11th or 12th century got farmers from Belgium and those areas to settle in the UK. And that reflects the fact that those people kept themselves enough separate from the rest of that area that they've maintained their genetic distinction, which was actually first shown very clearly just doing ABO blood typing. And what's the next? No, that's not the next. I probably missed one. But if you look there, you can begin to see more differences here between and the Welsh borders. You can begin to see differences between the north of England and Scotland. You can see differences between people from Northern Ireland who came from the north of Scotland and who came from the south. So you can get an extraordinary range of variation in the country, which is really, we thought, quite unexpected. There's one particularly relatively homogeneous group there, which seems to correspond to something I'll comment on now, which was where the major Roman occupations were. And it suggests an extraordinary stability in contrast to what's often assumed. Most people who lived under those situations, they didn't travel far. They found their husbands or wives in the neighboring village, if that far away. So there was a lot of stability with only small movements that accumulated over time, but that gave you these patterns. Otherwise, if there was not that stability, we could never see that sort of variation. And I just give you one example. We found one sample that we thought was said to come from Blackburn. Now, I was brought up in Manchester, and I know that Blackburn is a town that's just north of Manchester. But then when we looked at the data, we'd collected that sample in the north of Scotland here. We'd overlooked the fact that there's actually a blackburn up there too, and it was a typographical error. So that we actually identified that person as coming from the north of Scotland rather than from somewhere around Manchester, which shows the resolution of this sort of analysis. It's very small differences, but they're significant and they exist, and that's the nature of human population variation, partly because of the way the human species evolved in small groups, tending to cluster together and marry within each group and slightly outward, outside that group, and that gradually spreading over long periods of time. So the question is, to what extent can you explain some of these patterns of variation? I've already mentioned the fact that we know that the Orkney difference is likely to be because of the Norse Vikings that came from Norway there and stayed there for a long time, and if there was admixture, and if they differed genetically a little bit from the populations that were there before, that will show up. So the thing that we did, and the obvious thing to try and do, is to say, all right, supposing we have data, similar sort of data, although it wasn't as well put together in terms of the refinement of where people came from, the knowledge of that, from surrounding Europe. So we did an analysis of European countries, which actually on the back of a study of genetic variation in multiple sclerosis of 6,000 people, which when you spread it throughout Europe isn't much, but you could do the same sort of analysis, cluster people according to how similar they are in different European countries. And before I do that, I should have done this first, shouldn't I? I'm sorry. I've gone ahead of myself. I should have told you a little bit of history about the UK. It's a relatively simple country up in the north there that hasn't been sort of fought over. The last land proper invasion we had was in 1066. It's been pretty stable since then. It was connected by a land bridge with the continent, so that when the earliest... There are hominids that came over a long time before, and then later, of course, the Neanderthals. And there were probably people that settled there some 30,000 years ago. But the evidence is that there was no permanent settlement until the end of the last ice age, which was about 20,000 years ago. And when people probably came over the land there, but to some extent already came from this part, the western part of Europe, by sea. And then, of course, the big disruption was when the Romans conquered England. And the Romans, of course, they didn't all come from Rome. They came from all over the place. And they tended to keep from themselves. So there was very little expectation of any genetic influence of the Romans, but a huge influence culturally. And it's very important to remember that groups like that can have enormous cultural influence without affecting the genetic makeup of the average person, who at that time is going to be a peasant looking after the fields, rather than a baron looking after the fields that the peasant's looking after. And Romano-Britain didn't go, there was the Hadrian's Wall and things up here, but most of Romano-Britain was in this area. It didn't penetrate much into Wales at all, or into the West Country. And if you go to the next major stage, there were two major events of migration into the UK, which did have an influence because of the numbers on the makeup of the British population. And one of them was from the Angles and the Saxons. They came from what's Denmark, North Germany, and along here, and they invaded mostly the west coast. And that's why you've got the term England. That comes from Angle. And the Angles and the Saxons were the original English, if you will. But they came and they populated, but they intermixed. And as I'll tell you later, they didn't by any means entirely replace. And then the next invasion was from the Vikings. And there were different Vikings. There were similar culture from Norway. The Norse Vikings, I've already explained that they formed a settlement for many hundreds of years in the Orkney Islands and elsewhere up there, to some extent down here, the west coast of Scotland. And then there were the Danish Vikings who came and they settled the Danelaw, which is still recognized in the UK by the difference in the names of cities, of towns, which have a Danish background in a sense, rather than what you'd get, for instance, in Wales. So with that background, I go back to the fact that the way to study that is to find out more about the populations, all in terms of current populations around Europe and the borders that face the UK, and to say, what can that tell us about the makeup of the British populations? So we did this large study, and this is the result, which is worth looking at again. You can see here these sectors, these colours, reflect these different clusters of people. And if you just look at the colours, you can see that they're different in different countries. So Norway is different from Sweden, is different from Finland. The big cities are a bit mixed up. If you look at Italy, you can see that actually North and South Italy are well separated. You get variation here, you get variation along here. And I want you to notice, in particular, this group is 31, which overlaps southern France and Spain. And these groups, 11, 14, 17, 11 this year, 14 and 17, are largely along the coast here, the Normandy and into Brittany coast, and the north of France. I mention those because it turns out that when you do the analysis I'm going to describe, those are the groups that contribute most to an estimate of what affected the British population structure. And it was particularly striking, to me at least, that there were these quite marked differences between the different Scandinavian countries. So how do you approach that? You approach it statistically. You say, we've got these frequencies of different types in Europe. How can we explain the makeup of the British clusters as mixtures of the European clusters? And that's what we did. You could do a sort of a regression analysis that weights, that says, how would you make up a particular British cluster by different proportions of the European ones? And this is where you find out that if you exclude things that gave hardly any information, you only end up with about 9 of these clusters out of 50 or more that really contribute to the makeup of the British populations. And the next slide is our way of explaining that. So each of these circles is where there's one of those clusters that I've defined. And the sectors within them define the relative proportions of these different components, which are different components from the European clusters. We've grouped all the ones from Norway. These are some of the ones in northern France. And this one I want you to notice is quite notable, that red one. And just let's look at some of the features there. If you look at the blue, that's the obvious contribution that would come from the Vikings. You can see about a quarter of the makeup of the Orkney populations is reflected by coming in away from the Norse Vikings. And as you go down, the amount of blue is still there, and then gradually it diminishes until there's hardly any down here, which of course fits with what we know historically about what the Vikings did. Another thing to notice is these are the Welsh populations. And remember I mentioned to you that they came out, apart from Orkney, as more different from the rest of the country than any others. And that suggests actually that they in a way represent the oldest version that we can detect in the current population of the people that came to the British Isles. And notice this big red sector, which I mentioned to you. It's present everywhere except in the Welsh. So whatever it was, those people, and I'll mention that a bit later, didn't actually get across the Welsh mountains and into Wales. And Wales, of course, has been relatively separate from the rest of the country. And if there's anything that's represented of what people used to call the Celts, it would be this. And these bits of green, they are up there, but they're much more mixed up with other sources of data than they are in Wales. And if you look carefully, but I won't go into that, those data do support the idea of this small group that are a little England beyond Wales. So we've got, I think, a remarkable situation there where this pattern of variation that we really didn't expect that takes genetic differences and just plots them and show that they match the geographic differences, that this pattern of variation can be explained reasonably by admixture from the surrounding European populations. And when you do estimates, which you can do, of what proportion of the Orkney people, the Orcadians, can say they've got a Norse Viking background, well, it's 25%. That's actually quite a lot. But it contradicts the notion that here these Norse Viking raiders came and killed everybody off, and they completely replaced the population that was there, which were made up of Picts and others. That clearly isn't true. They might have come initially on their own, the male warriors, but then they clearly brought their wives with them, and then they clearly married locally. And you get exactly the same if you look at the Anglo-Saxons, without going into the detail. There's some of these components, the pink and the yellow, that are very characteristic of what you might say would have come from the Anglo-Saxon invasions. And our estimate again there is that in those populations going into what East Anglia, this bulk of the population there, where you might expect it most, you've got no more than maybe 30 to 40% at most of Anglo-Saxon admixture. And there'd been a lot of discussion about the notion that the Anglo-Saxon warriors came in and killed everybody off, but they didn't do that. They did, it seemed, survive better. They might have had more improved agriculture. There may have been epidemics that affected the balance between them and the others. But there's much less influence of this admixture than a lot of people claim. Now, I just want to mention again that one of our colleagues, who's one of the most famous, if not the most famous British archaeologists of these times, is Barry Cunliffe. If you want to read about anything about British archaeology, you should read his semi-popular book on that, which is remarkably detailed and very informative and easy to read. And he points out that there was a period of time when there was a lot of exchange between Northern Europe, the boundaries of Brittany, Normandy and that, and the south coast of Britain. And there was probably at that time a gradual admixture from there. And we believe that that represents this pink group, which people have not commented on before. All the other contributions have been commented on before. Now, many of you may be familiar with the fact that more recently, the technology has developed extraordinarily well to be able to look at ancient DNA samples. That means DNA taken from skeletons. You can go back to the to the Neanderthals, and that's famous work that Svante Paabo and others have done, and show they believe that most of us carry a small percentage, 1 or 2% of Neanderthal genome in us that may have been a reflection of exchange between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. Neanderthals died out from the UK before Homo sapiens really established itself there, but there are well-known sites. I've been to one of them in Israel, where it's quite clear that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals coexisted for some period of time in the same site. Well, this ancient DNA obviously has the interest that if you could do the typing adequately and get the same sort of genetic information, how would what you find with skeletons in the UK or somewhere else throughout Europe, how would that relate to what we now see? And there's been some controversial claims which I want to talk to you about and believe have been exaggerated, although the results are interesting. I show here a picture of what it's related to what Luca I talked about said. There was clearly one movement of agriculture, the Neolithic population, that came from the Middle East, from the Fertile Crescent. It's also clear, and that's been better defined more recently, that there was a movement that came round the west coast here, largely by people by boat from this area, the Aegean area, and they both arrived probably to the UK about 4000 BC. I'm using old-fashioned nomenclature, I'm afraid, about 6,000 years ago. The evidence is that by the time they got there, any difference genetically between the people at the origin of agriculture and the people on the north coast of Europe had probably been so diluted out that there was not much impact if there was some migration of people. But strangely, my archaeological colleagues say that the movement of agriculture throughout the UK was extraordinarily quick, something like 150 years only, to get from the bottom to the top, so that maybe by that time there was much more cultural transmission of knowledge of agriculture than genetic. Then there's a second migration that people have studied a lot called the Yamanaya, and it's related to a cultural group called the Beaker Populations, which brought a culture of beakers that you find all over. And they came later, about 2,500 years ago. So there's a question of, can you see traces of these different sorts of migrations? Well, there's a group notably connected with David Reich that quite recently have published 2 papers that claim quite strikingly, and you can read what they say, that in the one case, the Iberian Neolithic individuals were the ones that came to the UK. So they were the Aegean, not the ones from the directly across Europe. And that they totally replaced the British population, is their claim. And then they did another study on the Beaker populations. And they said these people, only 1,000 years later, totally replaced. Well, I have to say that I find that quite difficult to accept. I discussed it with my distinguished archaeological colleagues, and they tend to agree. So the question is, how can you reconcile their claims with what they found? Well, there are a lot of problems with collecting ancient samples. There's an obvious technical problem. You never get so far as good and refined data as we can get from 500,000 samples and do that study taking into account linkage disequilibrium. So you're never in as good a position to say this sample that we've got really looks more like something from one part of the UK than another. But there are a number of issues here. If you have a migration population, its influence is going to be somehow dependent on the number of migrants to the number in the population that's there already. Unless they kill them all off, like the white Europeans did in America or Australia, which as far as we know didn't happen there. So it's quite a big thing to claim that you've got complete replacement. The thing is they claim that for the Beaker population. Now the Beaker population came 1,000 years after agriculture had come to the UK. And one of the effects of agriculture is to have a rapid expansion of the population. So again, you'd have to argue that there was a huge contribution from those invaders that is even more difficult to explain when you've already had the expansion due to the agriculture that came with the Neolithic invaders. So I think, so the question is also, there's no sign in the UK. There's hardly any sign of any Iberian contribution. And the answer seems to be, and I get this very much from talking to Barry Cunliffe and Mark Robinson, my archaeological colleagues. These samples are obtained from graves, well-defined graves. And graves reflect very much the culture of a group. And there's a lot of evidence that graves can be essentially for elite people who came and didn't necessarily represent the populations of the time. And I think that has to be the explanation. So you get these graves that are quite distinctive. They are somewhat different from what you'd expect, but they do not reflect the population that you're sampling from there at the time. Consider how carefully we had to sample what we looked at. So if you read the literature, there's a huge fuss about this notion of replacement. And I think it's just the interpretation is fundamentally wrong. Of course, time will tell whether newer data can give more precise indications. There's some very good data from Ireland, which I think rather agrees with the sort of interpretation I'm giving and suggests that you really can't show that those ancient samples are representative of the populations you'd expect them to be. Well, through that, I've given you with a little introduction about what Luca was able to do, who really started this field off in many ways, and how you can take that sort of analysis and find out interesting things about current population. And I want to do something that I always forget to do, which is to acknowledge the many people who've been involved with me in this, members of my own laboratory, particularly Tammy and Bruce, where is he? Somewhere up there. We've worked very closely with the analysis group that are connected with the Wellcome Trust Human Genetics Centre in Oxford. We've worked, as I mentioned, with the archaeologists, and it really has to be a major collaborative effort to do something like this. We may only have done a few thousand, they're now doing hundreds of thousands. And it's interesting that the hundreds of thousands they're doing agree very largely with what we find, but at a much coarser level. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I think.